You didn't just witness a health update. You watched an ancient system reach its breaking point. You watched the most carefully controlled monarchy in Britain finally admit that it was hiding how close it came to losing the one person who makes the crown feel human. For months, the palace machine fed the world a glossy, sterile narrative. Planned, successful surgery. But behind the soaring palace walls, the truth was far grimmer, far more dangerous than anyone in power wanted to say out loud. This wasn't simply about Princess Kate's illness. This was about secrecy, control, and the ruthless calculation of institutional survival. She vanished. One day, the future queen was the most photographed woman on the planet. The next, she was a ghost. Schedules were quietly cancelled. William abruptly pulled out of engagements. There were no reassurance photos, no friendly waves, only the deafening, unsettling sound of silence. And every time the public asked a basic, legitimate question, the palace deployed the same cold, unforgiving shield: privacy, space, recovery. But privacy, in the royal world, is rarely about respect for a person's life. It is often a weapon of control, a sophisticated tool used to manage the perception of a fragile institution. The world naturally filled the void with rumors. They created wild theories, because the palace left them no other choice. And King Charles watched it all unfold. He watched the crown, the institution he had waited 7 decades to lead, slowly erode public trust, day by day, leak by leak, rumor by rumor. He knew the cost of that silence. He understood that when the monarchy manages perception instead of confronting reality, the structural flaws, the cracks in the palace walls, become impossible to ignore. His choice, the most crucial decision of his reign, had to be made: continue the protocol of quiet secrecy, or utterly shatter the mold and speak the truth. This choice was not just about Kate, it was about the survival of the monarchy itself. The palace's cold deployment of the word privacy was supposed to be a strategy, but it immediately became a self-inflicted wound. The weeks dragged into months of an utterly unprecedented silence. This wasn't the dignified, quiet recovery the courtiers had promised. This was a vacuum, aggressively sucking the institution's credibility away, hour by painstaking hour. When William, the future king, began cancelling engagements abruptly, with no explanation, the public knew instinctually that the situation was far more serious than they were being told. You don't lose sight of a princess for months by accident. The machinery that usually controlled the narrative, the courtiers, the press secretaries, the image makers, found themselves entirely unable to stop the bleeding. The carefully polished public image of stability was decaying into a desperate, paranoid secrecy. Whispers began to leak from within the most tightly controlled walls of the royal household. These weren't just journalists speculating. These were deep, subtle rumbles of genuine internal alarm. Reports began to surface of a quiet but fierce conflict behind the closed doors of Kensington Palace. A battle between Prince William and the entrenched old guard of advisors. The courtiers insisted on maintaining the stony-faced narrative of protocol first, fearing that any sign of vulnerability would embolden Republicans and erode the crown's power. But William, scarred by his mother Diana's fate under relentless media scrutiny, pushed back hard. He fought for the human element, for the right to protect his wife and family from the toxic cycle of speculation. The turning point was subtle, but devastating. Internal leaks suggesting the truth was worse than they say. An email subject line, a whispered concern these tiny betrayals, exposed the internal chaos. The carefully maintained mask of "we've got this under control" had slipped. King Charles, watching from his own private battle with illness, realized the terrible truth. The crisis was not Kate's health. The crisis was the palace's own unyielding commitment to secrecy. The old rules were now actively destroying the very thing they were meant to protect. He knew, with cold clarity, that if the institution couldn't even manage the simple truth, the entire fragile structure might collapse entirely. The king, a man who had dedicated 7 decades to mastering the immutable rules of the palace, understood the game better than anyone. He knew the courtiers were driven by a single, powerful fear: that vulnerability would lead to the crown's collapse. But Charles, facing his own diagnosis and his own period of institutional silence, had a unique perspective. He saw his daughter-in-law, the future of the monarchy, being destroyed not by her illness, but by the relentless speculation fueled by their very own suffocating protocol. The real turning point wasn't a PR meeting, it was deeply personal. It occurred during one of his quiet, unpublicized visits to Kate's bedside. What he witnessed there, the physical toll, the psychological weight of the isolation, the sheer humanity of her suffering, terrified him far more than any bad headline ever could. He saw his own mortality mirrored in her fight, and he saw the cost of absolute institutional rigidness. This was the moment Charles decided that maintaining the illusion of perfect control was a greater threat to the monarchy's long-term survival than the simple, difficult truth. If the crown could not even be human in the face of cancer, then what was it preserving? A cold, brittle artifact of history? He returned to Buckingham Palace and, in a moment that shook the ancient walls, overruled his entire court. This was the definitive, non-negotiable moment. No more hiding. If a king has to shatter a lifetime of protocol just to tell the truth, then the protocol itself is fundamentally broken. He didn't care about the optics or the inevitable criticism of their handling of the initial stages. His focus shifted entirely to the integrity of the message and the protection of Kate's humanity. Charles understood that his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had preserved the monarchy by mastering stoicism, but the world had changed. In the age of social media and relentless scrutiny, stoicism was no longer seen as strength. It was interpreted as deception. The future of the crown demanded a new kind of power, the power of honest vulnerability. The king commanded the immediate release of a statement that would not be filtered through the spin doctors, but delivered directly by Kate herself. This was the moment the palace machine was forced to yield to the painful, messy, but ultimately human reality. The king's command that the truth must be spoken by Kate and Kate alone resulted in the most powerful 94 seconds in modern royal history. It was a definitive, almost brutal indictment of the communication strategy that had preceded it. The video was intentionally stripped bare. No formal backdrop, no royal regalia, no polished palace spin. It was simply Kate, fragile and warm, sitting on a bench, confirming the worst fears of the nation. She spoke directly to the lens, using plain, immediate language that cut through all the institutional noise. This direct address achieved what 1,000 cold palace statements never could. Honest vulnerability. She confirmed the cancer, she explained the necessity of the silence for her children's sake, and she explicitly asked for the one thing the institution had failed to grant her: genuine, personal space. This was not a confession delivered on the palace's terms. It was a woman taking back control of her own narrative. The contrast was stark, almost overwhelming. On one side, you had the entrenched, self-preserving bureaucracy, using privacy as a weapon to manage public perception. On the other, you had Kate, using the painful truth to build immediate, deep public empathy. She didn't just update her medical chart, she rewrote the monarchy's script. Her decision to speak out became the ultimate lesson in modern institutional survival, that in the 21st century, authenticity is the ultimate form of authority. But the act of speaking the truth was only the beginning of a far more complex reality. Her announcement was a moment of profound sadness, but it was followed by months of cautious hope. Then came the subsequent, quiet announcement: cancer in remission. This news, while overwhelmingly positive, was not a fairy tale ending. It was a statement layered with inherent fragility. The palace, now navigating this new, humanized reality, was forced to confront the enduring question: what if it comes back? Remission is not a cure. It is a temporary, delicate balance. The monarchy now had to operate with a new, terrifying contingency plan. The future of the crown depended entirely on a woman whose health was now officially and publicly uncertain. The days of pretending that senior royals were invulnerable, tireless symbols were over. Kate's struggle had forced the entire institution to admit the one thing it had always tried to hide. The royal family is, tragically and beautifully, mortal. The trauma of those silent, secret months and the subsequent forced transparency resulted in an undeniable institutional reset. Kate's illness did not just change her. It forced the crown to abandon centuries of rigid protocol. The days of pretending that the senior members of the royal family were invulnerable, inexhaustible symbols are officially over. The palace was immediately forced to adjust its entire system of operation, creating a frightening and necessary contingency plan for a future where a senior royal might have to step away to survive. This means that every single courtier, every advisor, and every member of the family now operates with the cold, hard knowledge that health is not optional background noise. It is the central vulnerability of the entire system. When a monarchy's survival depends on the public image of a handful of humanized faces, every personal tragedy is, in fact, an existential test for the entire institution. The irony is profound. The woman the palace machine tried so hard to control, the one they initially smothered with a suffocating blanket of secrecy, is the one who ultimately taught the institution how to survive the modern age. Kate's legacy is now defined by her quiet, painful pushback. Her self-filmed video, delivered with such honest vulnerability, was a model of authenticity that the palace could never manufacture. She took her personal pain and transformed it into a powerful framework of empathy. This distinction is crucial. The crisis was not solved by spin or denial. It was resolved when the king chose the human element over the cold demands of the institution. The lesson is stark. The monarchy cannot survive in the 21st century by hiding its flaws or pretending to be immune to the tragedies that affect every family. The final question remains: can the monarchy go back to pretending nothing ever breaks behind palace walls? The answer, forged in the pain of the Princess of Wales, is a resounding no. The perfect fairy tale monarchy is dead. What remains is something messier, more fragile, and far more human, and perhaps, because of Kate's painful transparency, something that finally has a chance to endure. The core of this unprecedented crisis, King Charles's ultimate decision to force transparency, was driven by an understanding that the monarchy is not just a family entity. It is a public institution funded by the people. Therefore, the concealment of the central symbol's health was not merely a family request for privacy. It was an act of institutional betrayal against the millions who pay their taxes and lend the crown its very relevance. The question of trust is now irreversibly tied to the question of funding. When the royal family demands taxpayer-funded security and taxpayer-funded palaces, the public implicitly demands a minimum level of accountability and honesty in return. The sustained silence over Kate's true condition exposed a fundamental disconnect. The palace believed its right to privacy outweighed the public's right to truth about the health of its future queen. This crisis serves as a powerful test case for the monarchy's viability in the 21st century. It forces the public to ask difficult, existential questions. If the institution is so fragile that it must resort to deception to cover an illness, what deeper structural flaws are they hiding? The public does not want to just consume royal stories as gossip. They want to understand what the drama reveals about power, secrecy, and the institutions that still govern millions of lives. Kate's painful journey, therefore, became a powerful, unexpected lever for change. Her vulnerability established a new, tacit contract between the crown and the public. No more polished fairy tales. The trade-off for survival is simple. Trade rigid protocol for messy, honest humanity. The true, final reason King Charles said, "No more hiding," was because he saw the financial and political countdown running. He understood that in a modern democracy, an institution cannot be simultaneously publicly funded and secretly controlled. The erosion of trust was not just a PR problem, it was a political problem with a Republican consequence. His decision was a desperate, necessary measure to save the ancient institution by granting it the one thing it had always feared: accountability to the human truth. This is why this royal crisis is ultimately about you, your taxes, your trust, and the fundamental question of whether an ancient system can finally adapt to the human vulnerability it so desperately depends on. This, then, is the final reckoning. The story of Princess Kate's illness will not be remembered as a footnote in royal history. It will be chronicled as the definitive point of no return. It shattered the grand, enduring narrative that the royal family sells to the world, the narrative that they are somehow immune to the universal forces of mortality and tragedy. For decades, the palace relied on an image of unflinching, superhuman stoicism. That era is over. King Charles's final, difficult decision, no more hiding, was the official acknowledgement that the old rules no longer apply. The crisis forced a critical, painful distinction to be made. The difference between triumphing over tragedy and pretending tragedy does not exist. The Crown, under immense public and internal pressure, chose the former. This choice was fundamentally an act of self-preservation, but it was executed through the lens of humanity. Kate provided the institution with a new, necessary tool for survival: the power of authentic vulnerability. Her silent, arduous recovery and subsequent open statement have permanently reset the monarchy's public contract. They cannot go back to managing feelings. They must manage reality. They cannot continue to demand taxpayer funding while operating under a shroud of absolute secrecy. This realization that authenticity is now the highest form of authority is the real reason behind Charles's order. The monarchy will continue, as it always does. It will adapt the protocol. It will develop the contingency plans. But the image of the perfect, flawless system is dead. What remains is a system that has been stripped bare, forced to admit its own frailty. It is a system that can be shaken by the illness of one woman. It is a system, finally, that has been forced to confess that it can bleed. This, ultimately, is the truth about the Crown. If the monarchy wants to survive in a world that watched Kate suffer in real time, it must never again pretend that nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. The final judgment is not a critique. It is a profound observation on power, secrecy, and the difficult, necessary evolution of a historical institution in the modern age. The most vital takeaway from this relentless, painful saga is not about Kate's recovery. It is about you. This crisis forces a critical examination of how we, the public, choose to consume the narratives of power. When you scrolled past the headlines, when you read the vague statements, were you just consuming royal gossip? Or were you recognizing the test case it revealed about public accountability? The fundamental choice remains whether to simply accept the polished palace lines without context or to actively demand transparency. You hold the attention, and you pay the taxes. In a world demanding honesty, your engagement, your demand for the truth, is what ultimately determines the monarchy's capacity to evolve. The difficult, necessary evolution of the royal family is not an abstract political concept. It is tied to the emotional toll paid by the heirs. We have broken down the cold, hard logic of the king's decision. We have analyzed why the silence was a political problem with a Republican consequence. Now, you must ask the final, difficult questions of yourself. Do you still trust the palace when it comes to vital health updates about senior royals? What bothered you most about the Kate situation? The secrecy, the leaks, or the last-minute honesty? If a modern institution depends so heavily on one person like Kate, is that a strength or a weakness? This analysis is not complete until we understand the impact of your thoughts, your dissent, and your recognition of the complex human emotions beneath the crown. If this deep dive into the monarchy's machinery resonated with you, and if you are fundamentally tired of being fed polished palace lines without context, this space, this community, is where the real conversation is happening. We are dedicated to helping you understand how narratives about power, illness, and institutions are constructed, so that we don't just consume royal stories as gossip, but recognize what they reveal about the systems that govern our lives. We believe the drama beneath the crown is more than just sensationalism. It is a live test case for public accountability. We believe that true journalism lies not in simplifying the story into heroes and villains, but in relentlessly presenting the complexity, the intricate dance between personal feelings and institutional necessity. If you are a royal watcher who values analysis over adoration, and if you recognize that the future of the monarchy hinges on its ability to be honest, then the next step is simple. Join the conversation below. Tell me what you saw in that announcement. Was it a sign of weakness, or the beginning of necessary, humanizing strength? Do not just scroll past the royal drama, understand what it says about power, secrecy, and the institutions that still rule over millions of lives. By subscribing to this channel, you commit to seeing the full picture, the one where the mask is stripped bare, and the truth, however messy, is laid out clearly. We will continue to break down the logic behind every royal move, ensuring you are equipped not just with facts, but with the critical framework to understand the high-stakes political chess being played beneath the crown. Your engagement fuels this analysis. By joining us, you help ensure that the human cost of institutional secrecy is never forgotten. In the end, the story of Princess Kate's battle was never really about her medical chart. It was a crisis that forced an ancient institution to finally, painfully, confess its own vulnerability. It exposed the lie of the flawless facade, proving that the monarchy is deeply and irrevocably human. The ultimate message of King Charles's order, "No more hiding," was not an act of kindness. It was an act of survival. He recognized that the old protocols of stoicism and secrecy were not protecting the crown. They were actively killing it, and it was Kate's painful, authentic vulnerability that provided the only viable path forward. We began this analysis with the unsettling silence, but we conclude with the clear, unvarnished truth. The perfect, fairy tale monarchy is dead. It was killed by the simple, brutal reality of illness. What remains is a difficult, demanding, but potentially more honest future. If the crown wants to survive in a world that watched Kate suffer in real time, it cannot go back to pretending nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. Thank you for joining us for this essential analysis of power, pain, and the price of the crown. We will continue to decode the stories that matter.